Now, let me switch over and talk about Trump's foreign policy speech. This will be, by the way, the topic of my newsletter later on this evening, which you can get at gingrichproductions.com. I do 2 free newsletters every week, and they're available at gingrichproductions.com. So feel very free to go there and to sign up if you'd like to get them. And mine is going to be today about the Trump foreign policy speech. Let me talk a little bit about this speech because I think it's a very important speech. Trump is hard to measure by the traditional establishment because he's outside their game. The things that they want to measure him by aren't the things he's doing. I'll give you 2 examples. People talk about whether he is to the left of Hillary on foreign policy because he'd be very cautious about the use of force, or whether he's to the right of Hillary because he'd be very aggressive on trade and very aggressive on rebuilding our military. I think that misses the whole point. Trump is in a different world than Hillary. Hillary is in a world which has been created over the last quarter century by our elites. It's a world dominated by international organizations, by big conferences. I mean, watch John Kerry go from 5-star hotel to 5-star hotel to eat at fancy gourmet restaurants with other foreign ministers while they talk about big ideas as the world crumbles under them. That's the elite version of foreign policy. And as long as you're talking, everything's fine, even if everything's a disaster, because at least you're talking. And if you ask them at state, what are you doing about Syria, they'll say, well, we have a meeting next Thursday. It's a big deal, big meeting. It'll be the 11,000th meeting they've had while Syria disintegrates. So I think that Hillary has to be measured inside the world that she believes in. Trump believes in a very different world, and he's very clear in the speech. If you've not read it, we are linking to it in my newsletter, and I really recommend it to you very highly because when you get into it, he outlines both the principles he thinks about, and he outlines a very serious way to approach this question of national security and to approach how America should behave in the world. And interestingly, it's almost a throwback to Theodore Roosevelt and to some extent to Woodrow Wilson before we entered the war in 1917. Wilson was very cautious about getting involved in World War I. He wasn't at all sure that it was in America's interest. And it wasn't because he was an isolationist. Wilson's actually the first person I know of to talk about America first, which people have claimed since Trump's used the term means he's tied to the isolationists of the 1930s, because Charles Lindbergh, who had been very involved in who had flown across the Atlantic and was probably the second most famous American of his time after Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Lindbergh had talked about the concept of America first, and in their terms it meant stay out of Europe, don't fight the Nazis, don't get directly involved. It became a title for isolationism. Woodrow Wilson said the same thing in 1915. He said, wait a second, we don't have a British interest or a French interest or a German interest, we have an American interest. And this is exactly where Theodore Roosevelt had been. Roosevelt was very aggressive. He was very much about being involved in the international world. He actually won the Nobel Peace Prize for negotiating a peace between the Russians and the Japanese, ending the Russo-Japanese War. But he was very cautious about starting from the question, what is America's interest? Not what's some general vague world order interest, not what's the diplomatic class interest, what's America's interest. I think if you read the Trump speech, you will find that it's very helpful and very direct about how he would operate in foreign policy. I think it would mean you'd have to either retrain or replace about 90% of the Foreign Service, because I think the culture of the Foreign Service is so international and so unwilling to think about America first, that it would be very challenging to try to figure out how you would retrain them to be able to implement what he's talking about. But it's a coherent, rational policy. There's also this argument of, is he a hawk or is he a dove? This goes back to some extent to Henry Clay running in 1810 as what was called the war hawks. People wanted to go to war with Great Britain. And then it gradually became an issue of doves who wanted to avoid war and hawks who wanted to go to war. I don't think that Trump is either one. I think, to use a different bird, that Trump is an owl. He wants to be armed as heavily as any hawk, but he wants to be very cautious and not use that force very often. He wants to negotiate very aggressively on trade, but he wants to be very careful in negotiating, for example, with Russia and China, because they have nuclear weapons. and he has great respect for how dangerous nuclear weapons are. So this is a new model. It's a new approach. I urge you to read his speech, and of course I urge you to take a look at my newsletter. Now, we have a couple of questions that have come in. Joe DeSantis is helping me today. He's on this trip out here in Minnesota. The first is from Danny George, who says, can Trump win the general election without establishment support? Well, no. I mean, the first job Trump's going to have when he becomes the presumptive nominee, which may be if he wins Indiana next week, and the people I was with last night and this morning here in Indiana, when we were in Indiana, before we came to Minnesota, back when we were in Indiana a few hours ago, those folks all said to me they thought Trump would win Indiana. If he does win Indiana, I think it's over. He'll be the nominee. At that point, his first job is to pivot and rebond the party. If you're the presumptive nominee, you have the burden, you have the challenge. I said this on Sean Hannity last night. The challenge is on the presumptive nominee to bring in all the losers. The challenge isn't to the losers. They don't have an obligation to come back in. They can go home, they can go on vacation, they can go travel. So if he wants them to be part of a winning majority, if he wants them to play at Cleveland, if he wants them to be involved in their home states, he's going to have to pivot and reach out to the people who weren't for him. Now, I think that's the first building block towards a successful general election campaign. Lisa says, what do you think about Trump asking countries to pay us to defend them? We actually did that. If you go back and look at the the first campaign with Desert Shield and then Desert Storm, the total U.S. cost for that was about $5 billion. Secretary of State Jim Baker went around the world, talked to the Saudis, talked to the Japanese, talked to the Kuwaitis, and ultimately got an amazing percent of that war paid for by other countries. And the reasoning in part was that we had the military force, nobody else did. But at the same time, it was not fair to us, given that we were running budget deficits, for us to step in, pay all the costs, and leave. The old imperial model, by the way, would have been to have stepped in, driven out Saddam, and kept the oil. And that's, of course, what a lot of people were afraid we were going to do. So we didn't keep the oil, but we did keep enough money that we only put up the American share. That was about $5 billion in terms of being able to drive Saddam out of Kuwait in 1991. It was a remarkable diplomatic achievement by Secretary Baker. So we have done it before. There's certainly no reason you can't have burden sharing. We've had it for years. We have burden sharing in China, in Korea. We have burden sharing in Japan. We have burden sharing in Germany. And the reasoning is, let's say you're the Germans and you have a local air base. Well, why should we pay you to station our aircraft on your airfield to defend your country? Shouldn't you at least provide the air base while we provide the aircraft and the air crews and so forth? So I think that there's a practical part to that. I think it is doable. It would not be historically abnormal, and it's something we can certainly look at doing. Kevin Jones says, why don't countries spend more on their own defense? A couple reasons. First of all, they don't feel threatened. I mean, if you're Portugal or Denmark or Belgium, who's going to threaten you? The Germans aren't. They were the primary threat for the last 100 years. The French aren't. They were the primary threat for the previous 200 years. The Russians currently aren't. They're a long way off. And so I think there's this kind of, why would I spend more than I have to on defense? Second, all these countries have huge welfare states which just eat up their budget. They don't have any spare money because they're spending so much paying for their welfare state. And third, they think the United States is willing to do it, so let the U.S. do it. And that's why this is a legitimate, serious conversation that we're in the middle of with our allies. And where, by the way, Trump is not dramatically different than the Bush administration and Secretary Don Rumsfeld and others who, in the early 2001-2002 period, we were really telling the Europeans they ought to at least meet a 2% minimum. That's 2% of their gross domestic product. That would be a dramatic increase in the total amount spent on defense by the Europeans. And I think we should be pretty hard-nosed about insisting that they contribute some baseline to defending themselves. Let's see. Patrick Ortiz says, don't you think Wilson is the example of liberal interventionism? Yes, he became the symbol of liberal interventionism, but that was after 1915. Wilson tries really hard not to go to war. He'd intervened in South America. He'd intervened in Mexico in particular. So in that sense, he was an interventionist. There's no question about it. But he intervened where he thought it was in America's interest, and he intervened in a pretty limited way. And he thought that the European war was horrifying, that the number of people being killed was terrible, and he didn't want to be involved in it. And so Wilson really set a stage for avoiding that kind of combat. And only when we felt that we had no choice was Wilson finally prepared to go to war. Remember, he runs for re-election, refusing to be committed to the British and French side. And then finally is convinced in early 1917 by the German unrestricted submarine warfare that he has to get involved. But he didn't want to. And then once he gets involved, Wilson is one of those people who, whatever he did 110%. So once he got involved, he was a total interventionist, comes up with the idea of the League of Nations, tries to sell the U.S. on permanent involvement in an international organization, fails, and it doesn't get through the Congress, but clearly had become an interventionist by the end of that time. But he didn't start that way, and he really was closer to Theodore Roosevelt in the early days and being cautious about using American power, although Theodore Roosevelt actually was much more pro-ally, pro-Britain and France than was Woodrow Wilson. But that's a good catch, and I'm glad that you asked that. So let me see, we have here a report that I'm too close to the camera. Sorry about that. When we're on the road, sometimes I'm hand holding this, so it's not the same elegance you get in the office where we have all kinds of tools. It says here, Ann Mersch says, if we had gotten involved in Syria earlier, would it be better? I don't know. Is Iraq better? Is Libya better? Is Yemen better? Is Somalia better? You know, we went into Somalia in 1991 on a humanitarian mission. It's a total disaster. I don't think we have a model today, given the resources we're willing to spend, that enables us to think through how to make one of these countries succeed. The only successful models we've seen are authoritarian military-based dictatorships like Egypt or like Jordan, or religiously based dictatorships like Iran, or family-based dictatorships like Syria. But there's no successful evidence right now that we know how to go in there and how to build any kind of modern, safe, stable country with dramatic human rights. That's unfortunate. It's tragic for the people involved, but I think it's an objective reality. In any event, it gets us back to foreign policy. I do hope you'll both read my newsletter, and I hope that you will take a look at the Trump speech. It's a fascinating and serious effort to describe what we need to be doing, and I'll try to do a better job of holding this in the future. Thank you.